Hey guys, the video you're about to watch is about batteries in chess. The reason I created it is because on my chess skills blueprint, I list all of these different skills that you should learn to improve as a chess player. It starts at the very beginning with like how to play chess, what are the rules and stuff, and it goes all the way down through more intermediate and at the end advanced things that you should know if you're going to try to become a grandmaster. But along the way in this intermediate tactics section here, we have this line item on batteries, and this is important. They come up a lot in chess, and so I wanted to put together this video going over the basics and some more intermediate and advanced things to think through as well. So enjoy that, and if you do want a copy of this spreadsheet, link to my website is down below. It's got the spreadsheet as well as all my other courses, and so make sure you check that out if you haven't. Having said that, enjoy the video. What's up guys, in this video you're going to learn about batteries in chess, what they are, how to make them, why you should use them, and ultimately how you can win more games using some of the techniques that we're going to talk about here in just a minute. So we're going to start with the very basics in case you have no idea, you've never heard the term before, and then we're going to move forward and get to some more intermediate and advanced things towards the end of the video. Let's get started. All right, so when you hear the term battery in chess, it simply means you have two long-range pieces that are either along the same file, along the same diagonal, or along the same rank. So in this case, we have the queen and rook creating a battery here on the B file. We have the queen and bishop creating a battery along this B1, H7 diagonal. And then we have the queen and rook here creating a battery along the first rank. All right, and the reason that you would want to do this is because you gain more control over the squares along that particular file or diagonal or whatever the case may be. So in this example, all of these squares are actually controlled 2 times, because even though it just looks like the rook is controlling them, the queen is behind the rook. And so for example, if you imagine that black had some rooks here and decided to move the rook there, well, guess what? We could simply take it and we simply win a rook because we did have both of those pieces lined up there. Okay, so it's a way to really control a certain part of the board. In this diagonal, it would be over here. All of these squares are getting controlled 2 times. In some cases, you can even have a triple battery, which we'll come back to in just a little bit, right? We have 3 pieces controlling these. Okay. So that's all it is. That's a battery. You cannot do a battery with a king. You can't do a battery with a knight. You can't do a battery with a pawn because they can only go one space, or the knights have their own move, but you can't have another piece behind a knight to create a battery. Okay, so it's a queen, a rook, or a bishop that are capable of batteries. All right, let's go ahead and jump over now to some examples of how we can create these in actual games. All right, guys, so here's our first example position, and this position is actually black to play, and black plays a really bad move, the move g5. Now, the first type of battery that we're going to talk about that you can create is a queen and bishop battery, where the queen is in front of the bishop. All right, so as an example, queen to d3, notice how the bishop and the queen are now on the same diagonal. So we have the battery, the queen is in front of the bishop, and they are lined up towards our opponent's king. All right, now this is very common, right? When you play d4 at some point in the game, a lot of times you can maneuver your bishop back here. Very easy to do, right? It takes 2 moves. And then you can bring your queen up, or in this case, the queen comes over, right? You can create this in a lot of different ways. But once you do, you have a potential checkmate on h7 after your opponent has castled. Okay, so this is one that you want to keep in mind. And this particular position, it's actually really bad for black. The knight that's normally on f6 defending that square has been moved back for some reason. The bishop has been, moved to f6, and now black plays this really bad move, so they can't play g6 and block us. And actually, black's just losing next move. You can feel free to play around with the moves for black. It doesn't matter what they do. Any move, like they try to bring the knight over, we checkmate them. They try to run with their king somewhere, we still checkmate that. They can't stop it. Okay, so this is just a very basic and kind of silly example of the power of the queen and bishop battery when you have the queen in front. Okay, you can create some serious checkmate threats on your opponent's king. All right, now, of course, this is too easy. All right, so let me give you another example that's a little bit more normal, but also talk about how we can still make this work in our favor. All right, so here's the next position. It's white to play, and if you'd like to pause and find the best move for white, go ahead and do that, and then we'll talk through what I want you to realize about this position. All right, if you had a chance to do that. So the first thing that we need to understand is we have the queen and bishop battery that I mentioned previously already set up. We are threatening the h7 square. The problem is that there's a knight on f6, which is defending it, right? Which is pretty common. A lot of times your opponent's going to have a knight sitting here defending it. But what we can do in this position is play the very simple move bishop to g5. And we're simply going to attack the knight that's defending the pawn. And if we are able to, next move, we're going to take the knight. Because once we trade that off, guess what? We have a checkmate threat. And unfortunately for black, there's no good way to defend that. Like, I mean, I guess they can bring the queen over to defend the knight. It doesn't matter. We just take it. And even though they can take us back, they still get checkmated on h7, right? The only real way to stop the checkmate here, in this case, it would be just something like g6. But now the knight's undefended, and we simply take a free knight, and black has other problems in the future like this, right? So you can see how a very simple move, pairing this battery threat along with some of our other pieces, in this case, it's the bishop on g5, to get rid of whatever's stopping us from checkmating black, can be a very effective strategy, okay? And so keep this in mind. A lot of the times, once you set up a battery, you're not done yet, right? Your opponent's not just going to be like, oh, okay, here you go, checkmate. No, like, they're probably going to try to defend it, and you have to see what other pieces, other resources you have to undermine the defender, and then the battery becomes that much more effective, okay? So I just wanted to point that out, but this is a very simple example. Get rid of the knight, and you have checkmate on h7. All right, so the next type of battery I'm going to show you is again with the queen and the bishop, but in this case, it's going to be with the bishop in front of the queen. So in this position, we can play the move queen to c2. We create the same type of battery along the same diagonal, but notice the order of these pieces is switched. Now, to be honest with you guys, this is not going to be nearly as effective when it comes to checkmating your opponent's king as the other one that we looked at, right? You, generally speaking, if you're going for checkmate, you want to have the queen in front. Because the queen, if it gets next to the king and it's defended, and 9 times out of 10, it's going to be checkmate, right? Like, it's just a very powerful piece. The bishop, it's usually not checkmate. And so as an example here, black can just simply play h6. And if we trade this off and go check, black's just like, okay, I'm just going to move over. And black's king is actually really safe, right? If our queen was sitting there and the bishop was here, it's checkmate. But in this case, it's just a check, and it doesn't really do anything. We actually have to be careful that we don't lose our bishop next move, like to g6, and now we're just losing the game, right? So I'm not saying that you should never do this. I'm just saying it's not nearly as effective as if you take one extra move and prepare it by switching them around, right? You bring the bishop back, black does something, and then you play queen to d3. Now, black has to be much more careful about the position, okay? Now, while we're talking about this, here's a good example. We don't actually have a threat right now. Like, let's just say black plays a random move over here. We don't actually have a threat here, because if we take, black can take back with the knight, and they still have a defender on that h7 pawn. So in cases like this, a lot of times what you want to do is try to attack that knight with a pawn. And so I would be thinking about, how can I play e4, e5? Not only do I have a fork, even if this bishop were to move somewhere, I'm still attacking that knight. And once I force that knight to move, then my battery becomes most effective. So how could we do that in this position? Well, probably f3, e4 would be a good idea. If black takes, I can recapture with this pawn, and I'm still ready to go with e5. And that's going to cause black some problems. Now, you might want to prepare that, first by like maybe playing knight d2, get your king out of the center, and then you can think about this. You have to be careful just immediately going like that. If black is going to maybe play e5 and open up the center themselves, it could get kind of tricky. But these are the things you want to keep in the back of your mind, okay? Get the battery set up and then figure out a way to undermine the defender. All right, I kind of already talked about that. So going back though, the other way to do it is this way, okay? And even though it's not as effective, there are still cases where this makes a lot of sense. So let me go ahead and jump to another position, and I want to ask you guys to find the best move. All right, so here's the position. It's white to play. There's a very strong move here for white. See if you can find what it is. All right, if you had a chance to look at that, hopefully you noticed there's a battery right here. It's a queen and bishop battery along this diagonal, and like I showed last time, we have the bishop in front of the queen. And if you were trying to focus on the checkmate too much, something like this, there's just no way to do it, right? It's very well defended. Black has the knight to replace the other knight, and we can't really get rid of that guy right away. But what you can do instead is take advantage of the battery that you have here, putting pressure on this bishop. And we can actually play the move bishop takes h7 check, and when black captures our bishop, now we see the power of this battery. We take on e7, and we actually get a follow-up fork on these guys, and after black moves, we're just getting a whole bunch of material, right? We got a big advantage now for white. So that's a good one to keep in mind, and this just kind of shows how even though the bishop is in front, you can still have useful batteries in different situations like this. All right, so the next type of battery we're going to talk about is with 2 rooks. Now, there's generally speaking a couple of different ways you can do this. One of them that's the most common and probably the most effective is creating a battery of 2 rooks on an open file. So as a reminder, an open file means that there are no pawns on that file. There can be other pieces, but there's no pawns. So in this example, the E file is the only open file in this position. And one pretty good idea would be to play a move like either rook E3 or rook to E2. And bring over the other rook. So let's just make a random move for black, which is not a great move, but once we get our battery created, we now have complete control over that file. And if black were to try to play a rook here, they're just losing their rook and getting checkmated, but just losing their rook because they don't have enough pieces defending it because we have the battery. Now, it's not always this easy, right? Like as soon as black sees us doing this, to be smart, they would, bring this rook over. And now we go here, and it's going to be a trade. But even here, we have the option, if we wanted to, we could take with the queen, and we'll come more to this in just a second, a queen and rook battery, right? Again, controlling that square, and we're actually threatening to checkmate black right now. Like if they make a random move, game's over. We can use this battery along with the back rank mate tactic, and we win the game, okay? So you can see just from this really basic example how getting these pieces lined up on the open file can be very effective, okay? And this is probably the most common way, but you can also do it on a half open file. So let me give you an example of that. All right, so here's an example of a half open file, and that just as a reminder means that there's only one color pawn on the file. So on this D file, there's only black pawns. This is another example of a half open file for black because there's only a white pawn. Except this pawn is much weaker than our C4 pawn because our C4 pawn is defended, whereas black has a backward pawn and has no defenders. They've all been either captured or moved forward, right? So backward pawn. This is a very good target. So this would be a great time to create a battery. So we can bring our rook up, we can bring this rook over, and we're going to have long-term pressure on this pawn. If black ever tries to move this bishop, they have to be very careful that they don't just lose a pawn, right? We can even go further and create a triple battery, which we'll talk more about in just a second. And that can be very, very effective. Maybe knight to d5, trade off that bishop and try to win this pawn. And once that pawn falls, then this becomes weaker, and maybe we go into an endgame up a couple of pawns, right? So keep that in mind. Open files, half open files, and then I'm going to show you one more example of another situation when batteries make sense. All right, so we talked about open files, half open files, and the other kind of option with the rooks is when you're attacking the king along one of these flanks, either the A or the H file, sometimes even the G or the B files, but when you're attacking the king. Now, this also happens to be a half open file, so it does kind of overlap with the other example, but this is sort of a specific situation where you're going for the king along one of these, like I said, flank files. So doubling up the rooks can be a very good idea. Creating this battery with the rooks, sometimes even using the queen as well, or in addition to one of the rooks, is a good idea. Now, there is something that I want you to pay attention to here. In this example, we bring the rook over. We're attacking this pawn. Black obviously doesn't want to just let us take it and get to their king, but they can play the move h5, which is actually really annoying. And this is something you want to pay attention to. If your opponent has the option to push a pawn and kind of blunt the effectiveness of your battery, and you don't have a good way to deal with it, you have to be careful, because what's going to happen in this game now is we've spent some time maneuvering our rooks over here to the H file, and all of a sudden all they're doing is hitting a pawn. Unless we are either willing to sacrifice for that pawn, which I don't think makes enough sense in this position, or if we have an immediate follow-up, like maybe if we could play G4 and kind of just trade it off immediately, you might run into a situation where your rooks are actually misplaced. For example, if you imagine we make a move and now black, let's just say takes, and they take, and they start creating some counter threats, and all of a sudden there's an attack on our king. Maybe we don't want our rooks over here just lined up on this pawn. Maybe it doesn't make the most sense, right? So you have to think through that carefully, because a lot of the times, like I said, it does take time to create the battery, okay? So let me give you another example that'll make this more clear. This position here, very similar, okay, very similar, but when we create the battery now, does black have an easy way to blunt our rooks? And if you're saying, well, they can still play h5, that's not quite true, because first of all, we could en passant is one option. Now we do have the pawn, which is kind of stopping our rooks, but at least we have a passed pawn. We can push it with check, and it's going to be very annoying for black. Or we can play knight to f6 check, and tactically, there's this idea that we're going to sacrifice the knight right away. Okay, so for example, let's say black moves here. We're going to actually the sacrificing the rook makes more sense. But we have a sacrifice. That's the point I'm trying to make. We have an immediate sacrifice to where we're going to win the game now. I mean, this is terrible for black. They have to give up the bishop. We take it. It looks like we go here. Lots of good moves, but this is probably the easiest. You get the idea, right? Black's position is falling apart. So notice the difference from this position and this one. In this one, I don't really have, I think this was the original position, I don't really have a clear sacrifice lined up. I mean, yes, I can do this, but it's not nearly as good, right? I'm just probably losing now compared to this position where it's like, oh, we've got this knight f6 check. And by the way, if you're wondering, the reason that this is no good is because it opens up the queen here and we still have this threat. And so it's just too many pieces for the black king. So it's a subtle difference, but this is the kind of thing you want to think about when you're planning, going back to this original position. You know, do I want to move my rook up and create this battery or not? Okay, so hopefully that made sense and I didn't just confuse you. You got to really think through what's the follow-up going to be after the battery gets created. Okay. All right, so we've talked about queen and bishop batteries where the queen is in front. We've talked about the queen and bishop batteries where the queen is behind the bishop. We've talked about the rook batteries, the double rook batteries, and I think I hinted at it earlier, but there's also what's called a triple battery. That's where you have two rooks and the queen along the same file or rank. So here is a position. If you'd like to pause, think through what the best move might be. There's actually a couple of good moves, but think through that for a minute. All right, if you had a chance to do that, it's not too hard to guess the move. Queen to h2 is the best move. And what we are doing is, the problem is, yes, we can go ahead and make this trade, and it's still a good position for us, but we're going to lose two rooks for a queen and a pawn, right? It's roughly equal. Because we have the follow-up with the queen coming in, it's going to be fine, but you don't always have that. So in this case, queen to h2 is just a very simple solution. Piling up on that, and black doesn't have a good way to defend this. They can't really play rook f7. We've got it covered. They don't have any other pieces that can defend that, and so just by adding that extra piece, we are now threatening to simply take the pawn, right? If you imagine black waits to move over here, we're going to take here, and of course they can't take us. It's just checkmate, and yeah, and black's just losing. They're getting mated. And even on h5, remember the point that I mentioned earlier, do we have a good follow-up? Well, in this case, yes, we do. We can en passant. Now we have this annoying pawn. Yes, black can blockade it, but we have the sacrifice. It's pretty tactical, but ultimately this is very, very dangerous for black, okay? And so the point that you want to remember is that sometimes triple batteries are what you need to just get all those pieces lined up on that single spot. And if your opponent can't defend it, that can win you the game. Okay, so there's lots of different situations. I was having a hard time thinking of good examples, and so just keep an eye out. If you have both of your rooks lined up and you feel like I just need another piece, maybe consider getting the queen. Now, one more thing I just thought about. When you set up the triple battery, in this example, we've got a rook first, then we have the queen, then we have a rook. You're going to want to think through what exactly are you going to be trying to do with those pieces. So in this example, this works really well with the queen in the middle of the battery because of what we're trying to do. We're trying to take this pawn, and then after black takes, it would make a lot of sense to follow up with a queen check. Right? Sometimes you actually need to do a double sacrifice. So maybe you're going to give up both rooks, and it makes more sense for your queen to be behind because you want the queen to be sort of the last piece to come in. Very rarely, I think, would you ever want your queen to be in front. Generally speaking, you want the queen to be in the back, or sometimes, like in this example, the middle is going to be a good idea as well. Okay, so just keep that in mind. And that's pretty much what I had for you guys as far as batteries goes. I hope you learned something as far as when to use them, how to set them up, what to think through. Like I said, the big takeaway is that a lot of times you have to pair the battery with something else that's going on in the position. Like in this example, this knight on e5 paired with the battery is why the position is so good for white. You're preventing rook f7. You have a follow-up sacrifice. You also have this pawn really clamping down. Those are key features, so don't forget about these guys, that when you pair it with the battery ultimately leads to a really nice attack. All right. I'm rambling now, so I'm going to stop. Hopefully you guys learned something from this. And as always, stay sharp, play smart, take care.